Hi, everybody. So
Hi.
we're going to begin with a reading by Damir, uh, translated by Ellen. It's at the end of the first section. Ellen can give you a little bit of context, and then we'll get into our conversation.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to be here and exciting that this book has just come out. So the passage I'm going to read describes the protagonist, Mijo, who fought in World War II with the Ustaša forces. And he's been in hiding in the woods, looking over his village, and then he and his wife have set up a safe place for him under the house, hiding in the basement. And this is describing how he comes out of the woods where he's been living for quite a long time to hide under his house. Rising on his tiptoes, he looked around and then strode to the front of the house and hid along the wooden wall under the bundles of shucked corn cobs that hung from it and brushed his head tenderly. He held his breath to hear better. His heart pounded. He looked toward the window into the yellow flickering light of the kerosene lamp. Shadows played across the ceiling from the chipped cylinder, and he knew every crack in it. Ringing voices came from the house, the clatter of dishes. Then he straightened, tore himself abruptly away from the spot, and ran silently to the latched barn door. He took care to be sure that the hinges didn't creak in their pins. He slipped in among the walls that were coated in darkness, among the warm cattle. All were standing and watching him, their eyes wide. Only stirring were the chickens, housed beneath a wooden partition that began flapping their wings in fear. But, he thought, at least his wife upstairs will know he's finally arrived. He closed the door slowly behind him, patted the oxen. Both had white vertical stripes from their brows to their red muzzles. He sat on the wooden trough between the oxen, stroking them over their smooth, taut skin, and reached under the neck of one to the dappled cow. "How are you?" he said, with a lilt in his voice and a throat full of excitement, releasing with each new breath the tension in his body. The cattle, even before he'd made a sound, recognized him. They twisted their necks toward him, bathed him with warm steam from their wide nostrils, tried to catch him with their rough tongues, so grinning he had to fend them off with his elbows and keep them from licking his face and hair. The chickens kept up their clucking, but soon they too simmered down. He felt a joyous thrill that he was here in his barn, in his own home with his cattle, here right underneath his wife and children. And for a moment he was moved by this elation to break into song, to hold on to the welling of happiness inside him for as long as he could. Up above, overhead, the children were scampering about, giggling. The boards creaked and moved, so his thought of singing was bumped out by a new thought of moving somewhere safe as possible. And I'll stop there.
I mean, that's beautiful, and I think it's emblematic of the whole book. I think there's, despite it being like, as I've read some of the reviews, despite it being described as there are no easy answers, right? There are these, uh, and I agree that like any book that has them is somewhat deficient. Uh, but in this book, I think that there's a thumb that grazes the grasshopper. There's the corn. There's all of these descriptions of the material world that create um, uh, a that that are used as both sides of a coin. Like they are both hope and in the realm of the bottomless pit, for example, can be used as a, like a place of extreme fear. And I was wondering like where your understanding of the forest, but also like the natural world and like how you decided to use it in a book that is attempting to deal with like an enormous immense subject matter, perhaps not purposefully, but does inevitably.
Mhm.
Hvala i mislim da je ovaj odlomak odličan uvod i odličan uvod u ono što predstavlja kompletan ovaj roman. Iako znamo da nema lakih odgovora, ali ono što me interesuje, vrlo mi je zanimljivo bilo da motivi poput skakavca, kukuruza, opisi materijalnog svijeta mogu se iskoristiti kao opis novčića, dvije strane novčića. S jedne strane tu je nada, a s druge strane je beskrajna jama koja je u stvari strah. I ono što me interesuje, možda to niste namjerno, možda niste svjesno uradili, ali na koji način ste došli do toga i to da opišete šumu, prirodu, kako biste, dok se bavite nekom jako bitnom ljudskom temom?
U ovom romanu i šuma je jedan od likova.
In this novel, forest is also one of the protagonists.
Very clear. That's very clear.
To je vrlo jasno.
What led to your was it your what was your experience with it personally that allowed for it to that allowed it to be protagonist? Like, what about it fascinated? I mean, the character. I mean, there's so many scenes where is that where you spent a lot of time? I believe I read that you spent your entire childhood in the forest. Is this a memory? Like, is it? How does it figure in your like it becomes both a haven. It becomes both a haven and a bountiful place and a dangerous place at the same time. And I was wondering if that just is a parallel to the War of Independence, basically the remainder of the 90s. Like, the forest as perfect metaphor almost.
Da, vrlo je jasno da je šuma jedan od likova u ovom romanu i ono što me interesuje, što mi je zanimljivo, je do koje mjere je uticalo vaše lično iskustvo vezano za šumu da je iskoristite kao jedan od likova. U stvari, negdje sam pročitao da ste gotovo cijelo djetinjstvo proveli u prirodi u šumi. I ono što me interesuje, da li je te vaše lične uspomene, da li su one uticale na to da ona postane jedan od likova i koji predstavlja, nekako mi je zanimljivo, da li je to možda predstavlja istovremeno i jedno sklonište, sigurno mjesto, ali i opasan prostor, možda koji je povezan sa ratom za nezavisnost i možda je ta neko podsjećanje na 90.
Evo, dakle, u kojem kontekstu je šuma vrlo važna ovdje. Znači, ona stvara i suspens odmah na početku romana.
Well, in the context why the forest is so important in this novel, already at the beginning of the novel, it creates suspense.
Recimo u prvom poglavlju vojnik ima žutu uniformu, samo leži, ništa se ne događa, ali pada lišće, žuto lišće. I kada to lišće otpadne, on će biti vidljiv. Zato on mora u prvom poglavlju doći do skloništa dok god to lišće ne otpada. I znači to lišće koje pada, ono stvara zapravo suspens prvog poglavlja.
So, for example, already in the first chapter, we have a soldier in yellow uniform. He's doing nothing but lying down. And at the same time, the leaves are falling off the tree. So that is the suspense. But because once all the leaves are off the tree, on the ground, he will be visible. And before that happens, the soldier must find a shelter. Yeah.
Right.
Da. Šuma je... Da.
No.
Samo, da, šuma je jako važna u mojoj literaturi i što sam stari, sve više idem dublje u šumu.
Forest is generally very important in my books, and the older I am, I dive deeper into the forest. I go deeper into the forest.
A odrastao sam u šumi kao dječak i na neki način ona me je i spasila i formirala dok sam bio dječak, jer sam u njoj čitao svoje prve knjige. U šumi sam pročitao sa 10-12 godina Dostojevskog, Tolstoja, Balzaka, sve te klasike.
At the same time, I grew up in the forest, and in a way it saved me. I read a lot of books when I was a child in the forest. When I was a boy, 10 or 12 years old, I read a lot of literary classics like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Balzac. I read them all in that forest.
Ja sam odrastao u selu, u planini u kojoj nema ni škole, ni crkve, ni trgovine. Roditelji su mi nepismeni ljudi.
Well, I grew up in a village without church, without school, and without a shop. My parents are illiterate.
Kao mali dječak, penjao sam se na najveće drveće da bi vidio Ameriku.
As a very young boy, I used to climb up the trees to see the USA, to see America.
A viđao bi samo sela još blatnjavije od moga, tako blatnjava da bi poljski pisac Adam Mickiewicz rekao kako bi tu i psi trebali nositi čizme.
And I would only see other villages so muddy that Polish author Adam Mickiewicz would say that even dogs should wear boots in those villages.
A moja prva biblioteka je bio jedan poljski klozet, jer jedan susjed, pošto nismo imali WC papira, jedan susjed je donosio od negdje knjige i onda bi uzeo knjigu Dostojevskog, zabio bi čavao i onda bi se trgale stranice. Tako da se mogu pohvaliti i da sam pročitao najkraće izdanje Ani Karenjine koja je imala samo 20 strana.
So, and my first library was actually outside toilet, because one of my neighbors would bring these classic books and he would put them in the toilet and we would use them as toilet paper. So I can basically brag that I read the shortest possible edition of Anna Karenina with only 20 pages.
That's a very good bit. I wonder, that's very funny. I wonder if it's interesting because literature, it's not a referential book. There is not, though I can feel the influences, like the naturalist elements of some of the, like it actually in some ways, as you said, you spent your childhood in the forest. It seems as though, and more as you get older, you are returning to that forest. There is, in this book, you also go backwards in time to see if you can find an answer to what I believe the publisher called Mijo's the monstrosity, like how did he become this monster? But I actually think like you don't chart an easy course, but you do chart a psychological course, which is very literary. It is going through the father. Well, actually, it goes through the father towards in the third section, I believe. And I wonder if that was a conscious decision or if, as you were writing it, it kind of just made sense. Sometimes when I write, I don't necessarily have I have not mapped a course. It's just where it goes. And the forest I thought was like a good way of getting into this kind of question, like the psychological, like the regression of the protagonist. Or the attempt to figure it out, sorry.
Moram reći, ovaj opis je bio zaista smiješan. I da, vrlo mi je zanimljivo to korištenje prirodnih elemenata. I kao što ste rekli, proveli ste djetinjstvo u šumi. I sada kako starite, polako se vraćate u tu šumu. Isto tako radite i u romanu, idete vremenski unazad i na neki način pokušavate naći odgovor. I mislim da je izdavač isto rekao da odgovor na to na koji način je odgovor za mirnu monstruoznost, na koji način je postao takav. I ono što radite, ne idete lakim putem, vi idete lakim utabanim putem, ali birate onaj neki psihološki put. I interesuje me da li je to bila svjesna odluka da se iskoristi šuma, ti prirodni elementi, kako biste pokušali doći do tog odgovora?
Pa u svakom pisanju imam puno svjesnog, ali puno nesvjesnog. Inače sam ono što mi je bilo važno, da pokušam ući u labirinte svijesti takve osobe. Jer to su likovi vrlo kompleksni, kao kod Dostojevskog, istovremeno su žrtve i krvnici. I koristio sam sve moguće kako bi ga što bolje opisao, pa i prirodu. I isto tako, kako je rekao Montaigne, da bi nekoga razumjeli, moramo mu dugo i ljubopitljivo pratiti trag. I to sam ja radio u romanu. Onda pokušao sam na 100 strana opisati 3 generacije i 2 rata, što se čini nemogućim, ali kako govorio Faulkner, književnost jest pokušaj da se postigne nemoguće.
So yes, in all my writing, there is a lot of conscious, but there is also a lot of subconscious. I try to dive deep into the labyrinth of consciousness of those actors, to try to understand them, because they're at the same time simultaneously victims and butchers. And I use this to describe as better as possible their motivations. And in my book, I tried to use 100 pages of my book to describe 3 generations and 2 wars, which seems almost impossible. But as Faulkner said, literature is trying to achieve impossible.
Yes, and I was actually thinking of Faulkner as I was reading this. As I was reading Celebration for a few reasons, and one of the main reasons was that I believe I pulled the quote and I wrote it into the side of
I was actually thinking about Faulkner by reading Svetkovine iz nekoliko razloga, i jedan od glavnih razloga, a ovdje imam citat.
And so what he says is writing a novel is like building a chicken coop in a hurricane.
Gdje Faulkner kaže da pisanje romana je isto kao građenje kokošinjca za vrijeme uragana.
And I think that what you attempted with your book was exactly that. Like, it was in the middle of 2 wars, you were attempting to build something out of baling wire, dung, it was such an ambitious attempt. And what I guess what he is kind of getting at is, can you summon order out of chaos? And that is in some ways, or can you guide chaos into not perhaps your meaning, but meaning in general, or like somewhere around meaning, close to it, because, and yeah.
Sorry. I mislim da nekako da ste isto i vi pokušali to uraditi sa svojim romanom, i što je vrlo ambiciozna stvar. Pokušali ste između 2 rata izgraditi nešto od obične žice, od balege, i pokušati naći red u kompletnom haosu, ili jednostavno bar pokušati naći smisao tog haosa.
Ja inače, kad me mladi pisci pitaju za savjet, uvijek im kažem kako, a toga se ja držim, kako u pisanju romana postoje 3 važna pravila, ali još ne znamo koja.
I usually say when young authors ask me for advice how to write a novel, and when they ask me for advice on it, I usually say there are 3 important rules when writing a novel, but we still don't know what those rules are.
Inače, Faulkner mi je jedan od omiljenih pisaca.
Yes, and by the way, Faulkner is one of my favorite authors.
Yeah, and you can kind of, you do get the sense, like especially in books like Sound of Fury and Absalom, the world shifts around the character, and the character almost remains stationary. And time, like you did a really interesting thing with time. And as you said, you wanted to do 3 generations and 2 wars, which is extremely ambitious. But I think the language becomes more and more I don't want to say evocative, but that's the closest word I have at the moment. And I think this is I think there's this the beginning of the descent almost, like it the beginning of the descent feels as though it happens in the middle of Dogs, in which Mijo is asked to kill a dog that bit a police officer, and he goes into the woods once again looking for the dog. And I was wondering if I could have Ellen read perhaps the last 2 pages of that chapter, because I think the language shifts a little, but also details the rest of, like, starts the descent into the rest of the novel.
Da, i upravo sam htio sam još reći da kao kod Faulknera, gdje u djelima poput Absalom, nekako kompletan svijet se okreće oko likova, dok su likovi takvi gotovo nepokretni. I čini mi se da ste vi to isto uradili nekako sa mjestom. Opisali ste 3 generacije, 2 rata, i jezik postaje sve više i više, ne bi da iskoristim riječi evokativan, ali to je nešto najbliža riječ kojom bih mogao opisati ono što želim reći. I u jednom dijelu i tu opisujete i početak propadanja, gdje mislim da se vaš jezik polako počne mijenjati u poglavlju vezan psi, gdje u stvari Mijo dobije zadatak da ubije psa koji je ujeo policajca. I sada bi zamolio Ellen da pročita odlomak, pa ćemo nastaviti sa razgovorom.
So here is Mijo taking the dog up into the forest above the village. They sped up and crossed a meadow, pressed on all sides by fog, then a stretch of forest so close and inhospitable that each tree was pushing for more room. They arrived at a fir grove dotted with bushes, a fresh-smelling brook running among them. His breath quickened, and with his feelings unclear, he firmly chained the dog to a sapling, feeling the rain on his face that was seeking harmony with the burbling water. He closed his eyes, and the healing fluid sound soothed him. For a time, he watched the lively swirl of the water, his gaze ordinary. Everything today had to be ordinary. Then in his hair, he found a shaft of yellow straw, and through it, for a time, he sucked at the sharp air, wishing that nothing that was going on around him had anything to do with him. He took his knife, slowly cut through the watercourse of the little stream, watching how over its shiny blade the water flowed, and thinking of how everything in this world follows a higher order of its own that is beyond his grasp, and this cannot be stopped by anything. With abrupt movements, he stood up, but then sat back down, not knowing what it was he actually wanted. A wolf suddenly began to howl. The dog shot up and wholly sharpened its and thereby Mijo's ears. From the heart of the dark forest, a choir of vulpine voices bayed. They were tuning to each other. The dog went even more rigid, as if every part of its body were a tensed spring. Mijo went over to it, patted its bristling hackles, and said in a voice drawn from a deep shudder, "Little one, don't you be scared now." It began to whine, and Mijo stepped back from the reach of the chain. The dog whined louder, and the stump of its tail tried stubbornly to tuck between its back legs, as if the whole dog were the quivering stump. As the howls neared, the dog began to squeal and yank back as if to uproot the tree. When next it lurched forward, Mijo thrust his fingers deep in his ears. He ran, fell, scrambled up without thinking of anything but getting home as fast as he could. Near the village, he finally stopped. Around him flashed lightning, snuffing the few stars in the sky. As he went downhill through the yawning dark, he began to bark. The faster he walked and the louder he barked, he felt as if the faster he walked and the louder he barked. He felt as if he stopped barking, he'd die.
So I want to say just how beautiful that section is, and I reread it like several times. I I think that this is a good segue into the political aspects of the novel, his choices, your choices as a writer. To all we really know about the celebration is the top-hatted man who says some somewhat frustrating things, but we don't know what is done. We don't know exactly what atrocities Mijo is committed. We are somewhat in the dark, but we do have this naturalist sense. The wolves, like all of these natural elements that it seems as though there's a suggestion that there's a natural order that is so complicated and actually put in that section. There's an order that Mijo doesn't understand that is above him. And it seems almost as though we are all kind of beholden to that order. And no matter the wars, we can't seem to escape it. And I just want to hear what you think about that, and like how you sort of constructed it, why we didn't get into the specifics of the wars, why we kept it, why you created that distance, and that tether it only gets wider as opposed to getting shorter or getting narrower.
Htio bih prvo reći kako je prekrasan ovaj odlomak, pročitao sam ga nekoliko puta i mislim da je jako dobar ovaj odlomak, jako dobar uvod u politički aspekt vašeg romana. I ono što me interesuje, vaš izbor kao pisca. Mi znamo da je to samo čovjek, mi znamo da Mijo jeste nešto uradio, ali ne znamo šta je uradio. A istovremeno imamo te sve prirodne elemente koji nekako daju sugestiju da postoji prirodni poredak koji Mijo ne razumije, ali ga se pridržava. I imam osjećaj da svi mi se pridržavamo nekog prirodnog poretka koji je iznad nas, iako ne razumijemo. I ono što se u vašem romanu dešava, to je da i u tom svjetlu rata postoji taj prirodni poredak. I ono što me interesuje, zašto nemamo detaljan opis tog rata i nekako zašto postoji sve više i više se udaljavamo od rata, a ne približavamo njemu. Zbog čega ste napravili tu odluku?
Odmah da kažem na početku kako u mojoj književnosti jako važan jezik i kako imam sreće da radim stvarno sa odličnim prevoditeljima kao što je i gospođa Bursać, jer kako kaže Borges, prevođenje nije, kako bi rekao, ne prevode se rečenice, nego misli pisca.
At the beginning, I really need to emphasize the importance of language in my writing, and working with great authors like Ms. Bursać. As Borges once said, you don't translate the language, but the thoughts of author.
A što se tiče ovog poglavlja o psima, kad sam radio to poglavlje, onda sam se vratio u djetinjstvo i pokušao sam se sjetiti na koji način bi se mi rešavali psa, kad je recimo nekoga ugrizao ili kad je bio bolestan i onda postala su 3 načina. Prvi način je bio da ga se ubije iz puške, međutim metak je bio ljudima skup, osim toga ako pucaš u njega možeš ga gledati, pogoditi u čelo, onda ga moraš gledati u oči. I onda to nam je bilo grozno. Drugi način je da ga bacimo u neku jamu. To nam isto bilo grozno. Onda smo smatrali da je najbolji način da ga odvedemo u šumu i zavežemo za drvo. A zapravo je to najgrozniji način, a to tada nismo znali, pa sa time sam se koristio u romanu. Inače, kad on zaveže svoga psa za drvo, on trči i počne lajati. Laje zbog 2 stvari. Laje zato da nadomjesti svoga psa kojeg više nema, a laje zbog toga da se pretvori u životinju, jer počinje rat i on smatra da će kao životinja puno bolje izdržati taj rat.
As for this chapter about the dogs, I went back to my childhood, trying to think about how we would get rid of the dogs in case they beat someone, in case when they were ill or something like that. And there are 3 ways how to do it. The first one is to kill a dog with a rifle. However, a bullet at the time was very expensive, and this would force us to look a dog in the eyes. And that was unbearable. That was awful for us. The second way was to dump a dog in a pit, which was also awful for us. We thought it was cruel. And the third way, which we did, was to take a dog in the forest and tie him up for a tree. Later on, I would learn that was the most cruel way to do it. However, that was the way we chose. And in the part when Mijo takes his dog to the forest, when he ties him up for a tree, he starts running and starts howling. And he starts doing that for 2 reasons. One, as a compensation and solace over his lost dog. And the second reason is he's slowly turning into animal, because at the beginning, at the offset of the war, because becoming an animal is the easier way to survive the war.
I još nešto bih htio reći, da opet spomenem Borgesa, da se malo našalim. Kaže Borges da je najbolje književnost tamo gdje su stvari nejasne. Ali ja u svome romanu i često u svojim knjigama, pogotovo u ovoj proslavi, ostavio sam prostora čitateljima da sudjeluju na imaginativnoj i na etičkoj razini u interpretacije romana.
Yes, and I will again go back to Borges, and just to make a brief joke, he said that the best literature is unclear literature. And I usually, in my books, especially in this novel, In Celebration, I leave room to the reader, so that they can participate in both at the imaginative and ethical level.
Roman je rađen na način da mu se ne može više ni dodati ni oduzeti prava riječ, jedna riječ. To je kao kod Flaubera, znači svaka riječ treba biti na pravom mjestu i na pravi način odzvoniti.
So the novel has been written in a way that it's impossible to add another word or take away a word, because it's the same thing is with Flaubert. Every word needs to be in the exactly right place, and it needs to resonate exactly in the right way.
Ali isto tako sam htio napisati roman o tome kako fašizam raste na tlu neukosti. I to je tema vrlo aktualna i danas, više nego ikad.
But I also wanted to write a novel about about growing fascism on the soil of ignorance, topic that is current even today, maybe more so than ever.
No.
6 godina nisam bio zbog romana Proslava u svom rodnom kraju. Zato što ljudi misle zbog mojih stavova da sam ja neki ljevičar, komunista, anarhista, ali ja se samo, kako bih rekao, zalažem za one stvari koje za mene predstavljaju civilizacijske dosege.
After writing this novel, and because of this novel, I haven't visited my hometown, my birth village for 6 years, because people think, based on my stances, that I'm leftist, that I'm communist, that I'm an anarchist. But I only advocate for things that are civilizational achievements.
Prošao sam ovih 25 godina u književnosti stvarno puno prijetnji. Bio sam fizički napadnut, teško ranjen, bila mi je probijena slezena. Ali jednostavno nisam se nikada bojao i ja sam bio vojnik, tako da se ne bojim se.
Over the course of 25 years of my work in literature, I've been through a lot. I received threats, I've been physically attacked, I had erupted spleen because of the stabbing. However, I was a soldier. I used to be a soldier, and I've never felt fear.
Knjige koje volim, knjige koje pišem i knjige koje se zalažem, mislim da treba biti na strani pravde i ljudskosti. Ja ne mogu čitati ljubavnu poeziju Adolfa Hitlera.
Books that I love, books that I write, I believe that they should be on the side of justice and humanity. I cannot read love poetry by Adolf Hitler.
But I would just ask, what if we are on the side of human achievement, and if great works are done by like the same person who invents mustard gas is the same person who figures out how to feed millions of people. There's just, and in art, I would only say that in what makes this book kind of useful is because we conjure alongside you. There cannot be morality. It's not necessarily like justice and morality perhaps are being used interchangeably. I think that there is the possibility for justice because you give the reader enough room for them to conjure alongside you. But the moment you spoon feed them an answer, or like spoon feed them like a kind of morality, like you just said, you're confused for a communist, a leftist, an anarchist, when in reality you couldn't be easily confined to any of those parameters, or any of those taxonomies.
Da, pitam se samo šta ako smo na strani, šta u slučaju na strani smo ljudskih postignuća i šta ako ista osoba koja je izumila otrovni gas koji ubija ljude, ali istovremeno je pronašla način da nahrani milione ljudi. I ono što me interesuje, da li je i u vašem romanu pravda u moralnosti. Istovremeno dali ste čitateljima mogućnost da učestvuju s vama, da stvaraju zajedno sa vama, ali istovremeno dali dajete mi možda da dođu i do odgovora, mogućnost da dođu do odgovora. I sam ste spomenuli da su vas smiješali za komunistu, anarhistu, ljevičara, iako u stvarnosti niste imali, vaši stavovi nisu bili blisko povezani sa tim pokretima.
Pa volim književnost, volim umjetnost koja postavlja pitanja, a ne daje odgovore. I upravo ovaj roman poziva na, kako bi rekao, na polemiku, na razgovore. Jer taj Mijo, kako bih rekao, on je poput nekih vojnika u Americi koji odlaze u vojsku da bi dobili zdravstveno i socijalno. On je poput nekih vojnika u Rusiji koji se bore u Ukrajini i ne znaju zašto se bore. A mi smo okruženi s takvim ljudima. Da.
Well, I love literature. I love art that is asking questions, not giving answers. And this novel provides a space for discussion. For example, Mijo is like soldiers in the USA. For example, they enlist because of health insurance, or like soldiers from Russia who are in Ukraine in the battlefield without knowing exactly why they are there.
I zapravo koliko su mladi ljudi kada su neobrazovani, koliko su podložni toj desnoj ekstremnoj ideologiji.
And yes, and to what extent young people, when they are uneducated, to what extent they are susceptible to this extreme far-right ideology.
Yep. I think we should get to I mean, that's a great, I have far more questions, but I think we should get to some of the audience questions so we don't run out of time.
Ja imao bih još mnogo pitanja, ali mislim da bi trebalo sada da pređemo možda na pitanja iz publike, jer nemamo mnogo vremena.
Kako kažu, sve je rečeno, čeka se samo izvršenje kazne.
As they say, everything has been said, we are only waiting for the execution of punishment.
That sounds like the book, actually. So the first question is, are there other of your books that are being translated into Croatian? I would imagine English. There are two questions. Are there other of your books that are being translated into Croatian? Are there other contemporary Croatian writers whose work you recommend? And this is from Stepan Vlahović.
Imamo pitanje od Stjepana Vlahovića, mislim, da imamo dva pitanja. Da li su neke druge vaše knjige prevedene i da li postoje još neki savremeni hrvatski pisci čija biste djela preporučili?
Pa ja sam preveden na 10 jezika, a inače moja jedna knjiga je prvi prijevod sa hrvatske književnosti na arapski jezik. Bio sam gost u Kairu, Aleksandriji. Preveden sam na njemački, talijanski, na puno jezika. Sad sam potpisao ugovor sa španjolskim izdavačem za Latinsku Ameriku. Dobio sam gotovo sve važne književne nagrade na prostoru bivše Jugoslavije, tako da ima mojih knjiga svuda. A što se tiče pisaca, neću da ih spomenjem, rekao jednoga spomenuo se drugi naljuti, jer su pisci jako tašti.
Okay, as for my books, I've been translated into dozens of languages, around dozen of languages. One of my books has been translated into Arabic language. I was guest in Cairo and Alexandria. These translations include translations into German and Italian. But I also have recently signed a contract with a Spanish publisher for Latin America. So yes, as for other contemporary Croatian authors, I wouldn't like to mention any of them, because if I mention one, the other one would get angry. So yeah.
Okay.
I can jump in here just very briefly to say that another one of Damir's novels called Blue Moon is coming out with a UK press called Selkie's House. They are co-publishing Celebration with 2 lines, but they also decided to next year come out with this novel, Blue Moon.
Blue Moon je preveden, da, Blue Moon je inače preveden i objavljen u Parizu na francuski i na druge jezike. Mislim, objavljen sam i na ove naše jezike, rumunjski, bugarski, ne znam, dosta, ne mogu se više sjetiti.
Yes. Blue Moon has also been translated into French in Paris, but yes, my works have also been translated into our languages, such like Romanian, Bulgarian, etc.
I 10 godina me već zovu redatelji da snime film po romanu. Nisam nikome dao, jer nisam naišao na pravog redatelja, čak ni onakvog da bi mogu napraviti značajan promašaj. Ali moj jedan odličan prijatelj u Parizu je odličan prijatelj s Aki Kaurismäkijem i sad kad iđe roman u Londonu, gdje ću imati engleski prijevod, pa ću dati Kaurismäkiju, pa ću vidjeti šta će biti od toga.
For 10 years, different directors asked me to adapt it for a film, this Blue Moon book for a film. However, I've never been able to find the right director. At the same time, my publisher in France, in Paris, is a good friend with Aki Kaurismäki. So after the book is published in the UK, I will give it to Aki Kaurismäki and see what happens then.
That augurs well. We have a question from Leslie Absher. I was very moved by this story. I felt very sympathetic towards Mijo and the whole world of Celebration. Question, we know that Mijo has done some horrible things, but you choose not to reveal them or focus on them. Can you say more about this decision? Thank you.
Sljedeće pitanje od Leslie, koja kaže, jako sam dirnuta ovom pričom i suosjećam mnogo, dok sam je čitala, suosjećala sam mnogo i sa Mijom i sa njegovim svijetom. Mi znamo da ne opisujete, znamo da je Mijo uradio nešto strašno, ali ne opisujete šta je to u stvari. Da li nam možete reći nešto više o vašoj odluci da tako uradite?
Pa kad sam bio mali, gledao sam jedan film o Isusu i cijeli film vidio sam mu samo jedan dio haljine. I to me najviše fasciniralo u filmu. One stvari koje se ne vide.
Well, when I was a boy, I watched a film about Jesus, and throughout the entire movie, I was able to see only a section of his robe. And that was what fascinated me. I'm fascinated with things that cannot be, that are not visible.
Mislim da sam opisivao tu proslavu i ta događanja da bi išao nešto sasvim drugo, što nije moj način, nije način moje književnosti. Više mi je bitnije da, kako bih rekao, da čitatelj to proba zamisliti. To mi je puno moćnije, ali mora sa mnom sudjelovati u tome.
If I try to describe Celebration and the entire world, that would be, I would go into something completely different. But that is not my literature. That is not the way I write. And for me, more important thing is that the reader is slowly finding out and imagining it, that the reader imagines the world by themselves. But at the same time participating with me. My readers need to participate in the creation of the world with me.
Nakon proslave dogodilo su se strašne stvari. Ubijeno je na najsvirepiji način jako puno ljudi. Samo u Jasenovcu 80,000 ljudi, Židova, Srba, naprednih Hrvata.
After the celebration, horrible things happened. Thousands and thousands of people were killed in the most atrocious way. Only in Jasenovac concentration camp, around 80,000 people were killed, both Jews, Serbs, and enlightened Croats.
Da.
Croatians.
I kada se u trećem poglavlju pojavljuju Romi koji bježe, ali bježe tako da su im mnoge od zemlje kao da su već mrtve duše, oni ne bježe od osa ili pčele ili medvjeda, nego bježe od te države.
And in the third chapter, when we encounter Roma people they are escaping, but at the same time, their legs are like made of mud, made of wood, and they're escaping not from wasps or a bear. They're escaping that state.
Jer ja ovo pričam jer volim svoju državu i smatram da najprije trebamo počistiti ispred svoga praga, tek onda ispred tuđeg praga. Jer ako pokušavamo zaboraviti zločine iz prošlosti, otvaramo puteve novim zločinima u budućnosti.
I write about this because I love my country, and I'm of view that we first need to clean in front of our doors before we start cleaning in front of someone else's doors. Because when we start forgetting about crimes from the past, we pave the way for future crimes.
Uvijek me zanimao i taj nekakav kontekst gdje bi bio taj Mijo, možda da je rođen u New Yorku, možda bi svirao jako dobar džez ili bi možda bio sjajan glumac na Broadwayu.
And I've always been interested in the context. For example, if Mijo had been born in New York, perhaps he would have played very good jazz, or he would have been an excellent actor in Broadway.
Ali kad si rođen na krivom mjestu i kada si ambiciozan u ratu, onda također postaneš umjetnik, ali umjetnik na nožu.
But when you are born in a wrong place, when you are ambitious in the war or in a war, then you also become an artist, but an artist with a knife.
Da, i kada sam gledao film proslava koji se sad prikazuje i po cijelom prostoru Balkana, i ljudi plaču nakon filma zato što je to naša priča i ja sam u kinu proplakao jer to je priča o mojim djedovima.
And I watched the movie Celebrations. It is now being screened throughout the Balkans. And when people watch the movie in the movie theater, they cry. I also cried. They cry because it is our story. And I also cried. I cried because it is a story about my two grandfathers.
Život na Balkanu je težak. Kako kaže Emil Cioran, rumunski filozof, Balkan ide iz poraza u poraz, ali to je nekakav napredak.
Life in the Balkans is very difficult. As Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran says, life in the Balkans is going from the defeat to the defeat, but it's also some kind of development moving forward.
So we have a couple of more questions. I'm going to get to some of Ellen's questions now, and then we can maybe finish with one more for Damir. Ellen, can you tell us how you came to the book and what were the challenges and joys of translating Damir's writing? How does Celebration fit into your illustrious career as one of the most recognized translators of this region?
Well, thank you, Greg. I was approached by Two Lines and asked to do which often happens with books where they ask 5 or 6 different translators to translate pages that they ask for, a little sample, and then they ended up deciding that they would work with me, and I was delighted. There's certain kinds of writing that I find I get hypnotized by when I'm translating them, and I guess keep going over and over and over every sentence and thinking about the way the language works. And that happened in those first few pages I did of Damir's proslava, of celebration, and I knew that I really hoped they'd choose me, and they did, so I was very glad for that. As far as where it fits into my career as a translator, it comes rather late in my career. I'm in my 70s. I've been translating for 30 years, and in a way, that's a good thing because it means I have a lot of experience working among these languages, but pretty soon I have to start giving other people the really good books to work on.
You actually have another question for Ellen from Lori Wen. I'm sure you're often faced with choosing between one, providing background context, adding words that don't appear in the original sentence because native readers wouldn't need them, and two, leaving the sentence without added context so you wouldn't make the sentence clunky and slow the flow of thought. Could you please share with us two examples, one where you chose the former and one where you chose the latter, and the thought process that led to those decisions? That might be a slightly more complicated question than we have time to answer, but I'm also curious about the thought process. There's as Damir mentioned about Borges, it's not the words, it's the thought behind the words that one is trying to communicate. So like when do you adhere to language, and when do you adhere to the spirit of that language?
Well, one of the things we talked about, I mean, when I translate, I have this kind of idealistic idea that whoever reads this in English should know what the people knew who read it in Croatian, and that's obviously impossible. But there are certain, so I justify adding things where I feel it will allow the reader in English to understand. And in this case, the publisher did. So if you look at the first page, you'll see a year here, 1945, at the beginning of the first chapter, and each chapter has a year at the beginning. Now, those don't appear in the Croatian because somebody reading it in Croatian, by the time they got to the third or fourth page of the first chapter, would have a pretty good idea of when it's happening, and that simply wouldn't be true for somebody reading in the United States. Another piece was this issue of the Roma people running through the woods in terror from the fascist regime, because they were some of the first people who were taken to the camps. And we talked, Damir and I, and also the publisher, should we put a footnote in that explains the situation with Roma? Because of course, your average American reader will know about Jews being taken to camps during the Holocaust, but they might not be aware of the number of Roma who were killed during the Holocaust in camps. And so the question was, and this was a very important counterweight to the otherwise dominant theme of the Ustaša fascist development of the fascist troops. One of the very few things that you see that they did that was an atrocity was this relationship with Roma and the terror they felt. And we agreed that we didn't want to mar the flow of the story and interfere too much with it and pontificate in some form with a footnote. So what I did there was I used language, I heightened their fear to like sheer terror or something, just to make it clear that what they were dealing with was something very different than what the three people were dealing with as they walked through the forest. Oh dear, Aida, I'm sorry I took too long for that.
No, that's fine. No, we have some time. And Damir, the last question.
But I think Aida ought to be able to translate that for Damir first.
Oh,
right.
Ok. Pitanje su bile između ostalog, Ellen, kada je prevodila roman, kada je, pošto vrlo dešava se kada se neko djelo prevodi, da se mora staviti u kontekst za čitaoca koji nije. Kada je Ellen odlučivala se, prilagođavala jezik u prevodu, ili kada je koristila, kada je radila nešto vezano da stavi neki dodatak ili da ne stavi vezano za prevod. I ono što se dešava, na primjer, u engleskom izdanju ovog dijela, ima svako poglavlje počinje sa godinom. što nema u hrvatskom izdanju. Jer, na primjer, kada čitaoci u Hrvatskoj počnu već na 3. stranici, oni već znaju o čemu je riječ, dok, a s druge strane, čitaoci u Americi ne moraju biti upoznati sa tim i zbog toga je to bila odluka da se da neki prikaz na koje godine, na koji period, na koje događaje se odnosi to. Ima isto vezano je za Rome, kada oni bježe kroz šumu, u stvari kada bježe od fašističkog režima. Damir, izdavač, ja smo čak razgovarali da li da stavimo bilješke, fusnote, da objasnimo, jer, na primjer, prosječan čitalac u Americi je uglavnom upoznat sa tim šta se desilo sa Jevrejima, da su Jevreji bili u koncentracijskim kampovima, da su milioni ubijeni, ali, na primjer, ne moraju obavezno znati šta se desilo sa Romima i drugima i da ne moraju znati da su hiljade njih pobijeni za vrijeme Drugog svjetskog rata. Ali ono što smo, odluka je bila da ne pravimo previše bilježnički, da ne bismo poremetili tok romana.
Mislim da je to odlična ideja. Ako već nema fusnota, da se ipak nekako napravi mali ustupak, jer mi kada čitamo južnoameričke romane ne poznajemo taj neki kontekst, vrijeme i onda su nam bitne te neke stvari. Tako da sviđa mi se kako su to napravili, u kojoj mjeri. Što se tiče Roma, njih je u Hrvatskoj ustaška vlast ubila skoro 90%. Ali ja kad radim literaturu, kad radim roman, na neki način računam često i na znanje samih čitatelja. Jer ja njima ne mogu objašnjavati, ja ne mogu nekome objašnjavati tko je Stalin, tko je Hitler, ne znam, tko je, ne znam, Ceausescu i tako dalje.
I think it was an excellent idea. Although in a way to avoid footnotes, this was an elegant solution. It was an elegant concession, let's put it that way. And for example, when we read about authors, when we read novels by authors from Latin America, we do not understand time or the context. We may not understand the time or context, so it's a good help. As for Roma people, during the Ustaša regime in Croatia, 90% of them were killed. But when I write my books, I count on my reader knowing things, because I cannot explain to my reader who, for example, Stalin or Hitler or Ceausescu is.
Jako mi je bitan, u književnosti mi je jako bitan stil i pazim da mi se i to na neki način ne naruši, ali stil na onaj način da ne bude sam sebi svrhom, nego da se uvijek podredi tekstu. Kod mene uvijek ima u knjigama poezije, ali sa poezijom uvijek moramo pažljivo, kako govorio naš Nobelovac Ivo Andrić, ona je kao sol. Ako presoliš ne valja, ako staviš malo soli ne valja. Jer romani su horizontalni, tako se jezik strukturira, a poezija je okomita i ako je dobra, ona može doći do najudaljenijih stvari. I često mene pitaju neki ljudi, pa šta ti to, jesu to romani, da li su to soneti, da li su to, ne znam, da li je to poezija? Ja im onda uvijek kažem, kad su pitali člana ZZ Topa, da li vi svirate rock, roll ili blues? A on je rekao da.
Okay, yes. A style is very important in my writing, and I try not to disrupt the style. However, the style cannot be the purpose for itself. It needs to serve to the text. I do have some of poems, some of my poetry works and everything, but as Ivo Andrić, famous author from our region, said once, it is like salt. If you put too much salt, it's bad. But if you put enough, that's it. Just enough salt when you're cooking, that's a good meal, or in this case, good work. And for when we write prose, it is horizontal, but poetry is vertical. And people often ask me, when they ask me about my work, they ask me, do you write sonnets? Is it a sonnet? Is it a poetry? Or is it a prose? And I would always tell them, when people asked a singer from ZZ Top, when people asked me if the band played rock and roll or blues, he would just say yes.
I think we have one last question. Damir, did writing, this is from Greg Cantor as well. Damir, did writing Celebration help you to understand and reconcile war in your own memory and consciousness? Does your work and perspective as a reporter create any challenges to the personal, emotional experience of writing the novel? Thank you for your wonderful work.
If you could just, I apologize, if you just could repeat the questions. I had the technical issues. I apologize.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, thank you.
Damir, did writing Celebration help you to understand and reconcile a war in your own memory and consciousness? Does your work and perspective as a reporter create any challenges to the personal, emotional experience of writing the novel? Thank you for your wonderful work and for this conversation.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for. Damir, da li vam je pisanje Svetkovine u proslavi pomoglo da se nekako da shvatite i da se pomirimo sa ratom, sa onim što se desilo u ratu u vašoj svijesti? I još jedno pitanje, da li vam je vaš rad kao novinar predstavljao problem u pisanju vašeg djela? I na kraju htjeli bismo se zahvaliti vama na vašem divnom radu.
Pa, pisanje mi je, za mene je književnost poput religije.
For me, writing and literature is like a religion.
Iako ja više volim čitati nego pisati, jer je čitanje jako kreativno i kada čitamo mi, pa čak i ponovno neku knjigu, mi je uvijek na neki novi način oblikujemo.
Although I prefer reading to writing, because when we read, even if we reread the book, we still shape it again and reshape it when we read it.
Ali knjiga je baza, od nje se počinje i živimo u vremenu kada nam je potrebna mentalna higijena u vidu kvalitetnih knjiga, dobre glazbe, dobrih kazališta, dobrih filmova.
But the book is foundation. We live in the times when we need the good mental hygiene, which we can achieve when we need good music, good literature, and good theater.
A što se tiče novinarstva, pa mnogi pisci koje volim su bili novinari poput Markeza, pa Vargas Llosa je bio novinar. Tako, mislim, novinarstvo me je naučilo disciplini.
As for journalism and as for my work as a reporter, well, many authors were journalists, like Marquez, like Vargas Llosa, and journalism has taught me the discipline.
Da. I zahvalio bi ovoga i mojim izdavačima na divnoj knjizi i svima vama koje je moj roman zainteresirao. Jer kad smo bili mladi pisci, uvijek smo mislili u bivšoj Jugoslaviji uvijek smo mislili hoćemo li ikad biti objavljeni u Americi.
And I would just like to thank to my publisher for this wonderful book, wonderful translation. And I would like to thank you all for showing an interest in my book, because when we were young authors in former Yugoslavia, we were always wondering, we would always wonder whether we would be published.
Da, jer Amerika nas je puno formirala i po pitanju književnosti, glazbe, filma.
Because the USA has been very important in our formative years in terms of music and in terms of literature.
Well, I couldn't if anybody in the panel has not, like any of the attendees have not read it yet, you absolutely should. It's one of my favorite books of the year. I haven't read anything quite like it. This was wonderful. Thank you everybody for coming. I think that's all we have time for now, but I'm sure you'll be hearing more from Damir, and perhaps Ellen has a few more translations in her before she gives it up to lesser hands. And I want to thank
not lesser.
Two Lines and Pierce and Brookline Booksmith and Ida. Thank you everybody. See you soon.
Pozdrav. Pozdrav.